You have to be willing to take those losses. You have to be saying, it's okay that I failed.
Annie, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, it's really a joy. And Annie, I'd love to just actually start with your backstory. You're one of the winningest poker players in history, which is so wild to be talking to you. How did all of this come about?
So actually, somewhat accidentally. So I was a graduate student pursuing my PhD in cognitive science. I was at the University of Pennsylvania for 5 years. And I was going to go out and become an academic. I had my job talks lined up and, I'd finished my work and I got sick. So I actually ended up in the hospital for a couple of weeks and really just had to cancel my job talks and make a decision to take a year off while I was getting myself healthy so that I could continue on the academic path. And it was during that year that, to be quite honest, I just needed money. And I had some constraints on how I was going to be able to do that, given that I didn't feel well, so I couldn't really do a 9 to 5. I didn't want to reboot a new career because I already had one in the wings. And so I started playing poker just to try to make money. And, I had a knack for the game and obviously ended up doing pretty well and didn't go off to become a professor after all.
Yeah, you did. Oh my gosh. So where was there interest like early in your life for poker, or did this just kind of come on because of your circumstances in life, or was really the focus academia? Like, take me into that.
So in my family, the focus was both academics and cards. Interestingly, the third thing would have been tennis, which I also play. There was we didn't really play poker when I was growing up, but we played lots of cards. So we were very much a games family. It was kind of the way that we socialized as a family. Lots of Scrabble, cards, that kind of thing. My brother, Howard, became... he got really into chess when he was a teenager. He actually got to be a master. And then he decided that he wanted to study to become a grandmaster. And so he went to New York to study with a grandmaster in New York. And it was then that he started playing poker. So this was kind of the year before I went to college. And then I also went to college in New York. So I used to, hang out with him some, and I would watch him play. And then when I went to graduate school, but I didn't play myself. When I went to graduate school, he had already made the final table of the World Series of Poker by that point. Wow. Or maybe my first year of graduate school, he did that. And then he started flying me out to Las Vegas once a year for a vacation, which was great because I couldn't afford it. I was living on a fellowship. And Vegas is kind of like boring if you don't gamble. And by gamble, I mean blackjack or whatever. And I didn't want to do that. And so he actually gave me some money to go play poker when, just sort of with a few tips, and I did pretty well at it, but I was never like, oh, I should go be a poker player for a living. I was going to be an academic. But so I played a little bit. So when my brother suggested that maybe I do that in the meantime, before I went back to graduate school, it wasn't like totally out of the blue. But just one thing, just to set the stage for people to understand, is like now I think it feels less weird because poker's on television. But back then, there was no poker on television. There wasn't any internet poker. It was a very strange thing to go off and do. And I got a lot of strange looks about it. But, here I am today. So I guess it worked out.
And you're in academia today?
So I it's a variety of things that I do today.
Okay.
So I am a consultant, helping executives and teams make better decisions. I obviously am a writer. I've written a bunch of books. And then I also am an academic again. So I am back at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm active in research there, both a research line with Linnea Gandhi and Marie Schweitzer, where we do research on a decision tool called premortems. And then I also work with Phil Tetlock and Barb Mellers Phil Tetlock is probably most famous for a book he wrote called Super Forecasting, the Art and Science of Prediction, which is an amazing book. I would highly recommend that people read it. And I work with them on how you might train people to be better forecasters, and then how you might get that training to transfer to other domains, which is super fun. And I'm actually going to button up my PhD. That's in process. And then I teach executive education at the Wharton School also. So I did eventually circle back. It was many, many years later, but I did eventually circle back to academics.
What a storied career thus far. And you do have a new book out. It's called Quit, which we're going to talk about today. And I'm fascinated. And what I was fascinated about in getting to talk with you about, Annie, is connecting some of the principles of poker initially to where we're headed today, which is about how to discern when to quit. So I'd love to just even just spring off of this and ask, like, what did poker teach you about how to think strategically, weighing short and long-term potential consequences about when to fold, when to quit?
So I think it's interesting that the majority of the problem that we have as decision makers and poker players is actually just not being willing to quit enough. And I think that this is actually quite counterintuitive, because there's obviously a very strong narrative around grit, and that we need to persevere more. And I think it's, definitely true. I mean, I'm a big fan of Angela Duckworth, and big fan of her work in the book Grit. It's true that sometimes when things are hard, we quit too soon. That is true. And we need to have a longer term view on things, and recognize when things are worthwhile, even though they're hard, that it's worth it to sort of power through what those obstacles are and those challenges are in order to get to the final goal. So I don't have any quibble with that. The quibble that I really have is that I think that we don't think about the fact that when to quit and when to stick it out are actually the same decision, and that context really matters, right? So you have to be thinking about the context of what's the right choice here to persevere or not. And it turns out that I think partly because we think about grit as a virtue and quitting as a vice. Like if I called you a quitter, I'd be insulting you. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I'm a coward or something like that, right?
You're such a quitter, right? Like, what a loser. That I think that because of the way our mind works, we just sort of think grit is good and quit is bad, and so you should stick. And that particular way of thinking about it is actually amplifying a host of cognitive biases that we have that kind of get us to stay in things too long. And a lot of that you can see at the poker table. So people do sometimes fold too early. I mean, that does happen. But mostly what you hear from amateurs in particular is, a couple of things. One is a desire to find out how the hand turns out. So it's so incredibly painful for them to fold a hand when the rest of the cards come out, because when you're folding before all the cards are seen, right? Which is correct to do, because you shouldn't play every hand till the end. That would make it not a skill game. But when they fold a hand that then it turns out would have won, it's incredibly painful for them. So what we sort of rather do as human beings is kind of stick it out, even if we're sort of, long run losing to the decision, so that we know that we didn't have a choice but to fold. So I think that's one of the problems, is we don't like that idea that maybe it would have worked out if we had just stuck around, and that feeling of loss that we get when it would have worked out had we stayed. So I think that's one problem. I think another problem that sort of gets people to stay in hands too long, and this is true for life as well, is just simply a sunk cost issue. That what you hear from poker players at the table all the time is, I can't fold because I have too much money in the pot. And the issue with that is that money's already in the pot, right? Like, what really matters is the next dollar that you're going to bet worth your time. And so we can translate that to you're pursuing a project, and why don't you want to quit? For fear that you will have wasted the time that you already spent. But that's not the right way to think about it. Is the next minute that you spend on this project worthwhile, regardless of whatever it's been spent? Because the resources that I have to spend going forward could be spent on a variety of different opportunities. In poker, it could be the next hand I play or another hand I play, but it could be another project that I might be pursuing, or a different job that I might be pursuing, or a different relationship that I might be pursuing. And what I want to do is make sure that I'm putting my resources into the things that are going to help me to advance toward my goals the most. And if the thing that I'm doing is not a winning decision, then I ought not to do it. It's a waste for me to put my money there as opposed to somewhere else. But the problem is that we can see that sort of as a fresh decision, right? Like I'm considering a bunch of things to start. And we'll think about it as a fresh decision. What's the best place for me to be? But once we've actually made the decision and we've started something, we don't then think the same way. Now we think about all the time and energy that we've put into it so far, and we count that. And we shouldn't. And an interesting place where you can see that kind of behavior away from the poker table is actually in thinking about, once we start a war, how do we get out of it? Because part of what happens is that, separate and apart from the money that you've spent on the war, which people don't want to feel like was a waste, there are lives spent on the war. So you start, there are casualties, right? People lose their lives fighting in the war. And you'll hear, Gold Star parents say, and politicians say, like, I don't want their lives to go to waste, right? And I totally understand the sentiment, but of course it's the same problem, right? Which is the tragedy of those lives. What we need to think about is it right for us to send the next person into battle? Is it worth it for us to do that? Because do we want to waste another life? So the issue here is that we think about waste as a backward-looking problem, right? Like, I don't want them to have died in vain. And we don't think about waste as a forward-looking problem, which is, should the next person die in vain, right? And so obviously there are some wars where we determine that is worthwhile, that the chances that we win, that we achieve our goals, that we push back, an authoritarian nation or someone who's encroaching on our borders or whatever, that it's worth that. And then there's others where I think that people can see pretty clearly that it's no longer worthwhile, but it becomes very hard to extricate on a much larger and higher stakes stage than at the poker table, for the same reason, because we think we have too much money in the pot, right? Because we've lost too much already. And I think an interesting thing about that particular problem is that George Ball, who was the Secretary of State at the time that the Vietnam War was started, actually said this. He said, we have to really watch out getting involved in this war, because we won't be able to extricate ourselves, largely for these kinds of reasons. And that came out in the Pentagon Papers, that there had been warnings about this particular problem of, be careful what you start, right? Because it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to get out of it. So I think that's also a really big issue at the poker table that makes it hard for people to fold. And then the last one is just over-optimism. I think they think they're more likely to win than they are, and so they keep going. But one of the things that I say is that one of the things that really separates, probably the main thing that separates great poker players from amateurs, is this ability to fold. Great poker players just fold a lot more than amateurs do. And I think that's very counterintuitive.
Okay, I'm really fascinated on this, especially what you just shared. And I want to double click on something you began talking about moments ago, and it was this. Do we quit enough? Will you unpack that a little bit more?
Sure.
And what does that mean tactically in terms of perhaps how we would frame day-to-day decisions about relationships, financial investments? Obviously, there's a lot of geopolitical turmoil happening right now, but I'm fascinated by what you set this whole thing up with. Do we quit enough? What does that mean?
So let me ask you something. Like,
sure.
Have you ever had this happen where you're in a job or you're in a relationship and you finally decide to quit and walk away, and you walk away? How often does it happen that you say to yourself, oh, now that I'm out of it, I see I should have done that a lot sooner? Like every time?
I don't know about every time, if I'm being totally honest, but almost.
Almost every time.
Yeah. Yes.
And so this brings up something that's just true about quitting, is that usually if you quit on time, it'll actually feel like you quit too early. And the reason...
Wait, say that again. You got to say
Yeah.
that again. That's too good.
If you quit on time, it will usually feel like you quit too early. So let's think about why that is. So
Okay.
whenever you make any decision, it's made under uncertainty, right? Like there's
Yeah.
all sorts of stuff you don't know. You know very little in comparison to what there is to be known that would influence the decision. I'm sure you've had that feeling, if I knew then what I knew now, like...
Oh, that happens all the time.
Right. So that's that hidden information problem, that feeling of like there are missing pieces in terms of the way
Yes.
that you're thinking about the decision. And then there's just the influence of luck. Like, you know, you can make a perfectly good decision and I can go through a green light and I can get in an accident, right? So that can happen. So we're making that decision when we're very uncertain. And then sometimes, like, you know, a lot of people get sort of paralysis by analysis, where they're trying to get to a level of certainty that's unachievable.
Yep.
And they're actually too slow to start. That can happen. But regardless, like when we make a decision after the fact, we're going to learn new information. Sometimes that information is going to be information about like, hey, things are working out pretty well. But a lot of times it's going to be information like, hey, things aren't working out too well at all. And we have the intuition that when we get that signal, like things aren't working out, like we're on the top of Everest and it was a clear day when we started up to the summit, but now a snowstorm rolls in, that will turn around, right? That will stop. That when we take a job that we think is going to be great and we start getting information that the culture is toxic, that we'll quit. So we think that this is true, that we're going to respond to this information in that particular way. And it turns out that intuition is just quite poor. That actually we don't actually respond to it that way, and instead we tend to escalate our commitment and kind of continue on the way. And I think that part of the reason for that is because the decision to quit is also made under uncertainty. So we're kind of certainty seekers as organisms, like that's the way our cognition works. And we need to know kind of for sure that the path we're on isn't going to work out before we're willing to switch. But, you know, Richard Thaler, who has a Nobel laureate, so I like to listen to what Nobel laureates say. I think it's a good strategy.
Yeah.
He said something I think that was really insightful, which is by the time you're generally willing to quit, it's not really a choice anymore. So you could think about, like, once you're sort of in it and you're heading up Everest, if a huge blizzard comes in, you don't really have a choice anymore. You have to turn around. That's when we're kind of willing to turn around. Not when, the weather looks kind of iffy, but I'm not sure. Right? We're not really willing to turn around at that point. And you can hear people all the time, like when people are saying, like, why are you still in this relationship? Well, I know I can turn it around. Why are you still in this job? I know I can turn it around. Employers, like talking to sales leaders, why are you still pursuing this account? Because I know I can turn it around. Why are you still doing this project? Because I know I can turn it around. Because the thing is that at the point that you're going to do it, if it's right, you're not going to be in a situation that's so dire that you don't have a choice anymore. Okay, so we actually have science that shows that this is true. And I think that this is a really fun one from Stephen Levitt, who, you're very famous for Freakonomics, right? Lots of TED Talks, the book, Freakonomics,
Sure.
and the follow-up, Super Freakonomics. He's got a great podcast called Freakonomics. And he did kind of a fun thing. He threw a website up and he said, hey, if you have a big life decision, should you quit your job? Should you end your relationship? Should you shut the project down? Should you fire somebody? Whatever. Come to my website and you can input what your decision is that you're trying to decide whether to stick or walk away. And I'm going to you'll have a virtual coin will be flipped for you. And it's like heads, you grit, tails, you quit. Okay, so that seems bizarre. Like, who's ever going to go, like, I'm going to go flip a virtual coin to figure out whether I should quit my job?
Well, yeah, right.
20,000 people did it.
No.
And I think that this is what we can surmise from this. Tell me if you agree with this. If someone's willing to flip a coin in order to make this decision, it means they think the decision is 50-50.
Yeah, Annie, it's sort of like I think about it like finances in investing. You know, if I think about an investment, if I'm going to put a pile of cash on the table and say I'm going to light it on fire right now, that's the amount I'm willing to just put it on the line and say I'm going to flip the coin.
Right.
That's how I sort of look at what you're saying.
So in this particular case, like if you're willing to flip a coin to decide, should I stay in my job or leave?
Yep.
You must think it's a very close call. Because otherwise you would never do that. You wouldn't flip a coin for that. You have to think it's a super close call. So if we think about like what's the point of that decision, which is to help you achieve your goals, let's say your goal is happiness. What that means is you think that it's a very close call whether staying in the job is going to create happiness for you or leaving the job is going to create happiness for you. So by definition, you kind of think it's a 50-50 choice, like you're willing to flip a coin. So Levitt had these people do it, and then he checked in with them 2 months later and 6 months later. And if our perception of that decision is correct, and it's really, really a close call, then what you would expect is that the people who were told to quit would be just as happy as the people who were told to stick. Because that's kind of the definition of a close call, that they would be equally happy when you checked in with them later.
Right.
And that's not what he found. What he found was that for big life decisions, when he checked in 2 months later and 6 months later, that the quitters were generally happier on average. So what does that tell you? Is that when we think it's a close call, it's actually not close at all, and quitting is actually the better choice. So what that means is that people are getting to the point where they think it's a close call much later. So they've gotten more information than they actually need to actually make the quitting decision, because they're getting to it well after it's actually a 50-50 choice. And then we can work backwards from that and say, well, what that means is that when you quit on time, like if you were objectively perfect at quitting, it's generally going to feel like you're quitting too early. And the reason for that is that quitting is a forecasting problem like anything else. You have to say, given what I see around me, where I'm not on the brink of death, as I look ahead, I can see that things aren't going to be very good in the future if I stay. So I'm going to free my resources up now to move to something that advances me toward my goals by more. But what that means, again, is that nothing particularly dire is going to be happening to you in the moment that it's probably appropriate to quit.
What have you discovered through the neuroscience of all this? What does brain science tell us about how we're wired in all of that in this conversation? In other words, a better question is this: what does neuroscience dictate regarding the influence in this conversation?
So I'm going to speak to cognitive science, but, which is related. But
that's great, yeah.
There's so many things. So basically, there's just a lot of biases in our decision making, and biases really can take hold in these uncertain situations, right, where we're not as disciplined by sort of the objective facts. But there's a variety of things that kind of wrap into this that tell you that quitting is a really hard choice for us. So one of them we've already talked about, which is the sunk cost effect or the sunk cost fallacy, this feeling of the resources that you've already spent on something will have been wasted if you walk away. So that's a very big one. There's also something called status quo bias, which is we have a preference for the status quo. We don't like to change from the status quo. And what goes along with that is something called omission-commission bias, which is we're much more tolerant of getting bad outcomes from sort of not deciding than from just making some new decision. So that pairs with status quo. So in other words, if I'm in a job that I don't really like and I just sort of stick to it and, I sort of stay kind of unhappy, I'm more tolerant of that for myself than if I take a new job and it doesn't work out. And this is so much so that, like, for the book, I talked to someone named, a wonderful woman named Dr. Sarah Olson Martinez, and she was thinking about quitting her job as an emergency medicine administrator and emergency medicine doctor. And there were a variety of things that had changed in her life that made her very unhappy in her position. And she had another job offer on the table for something that was would have been with an insurance company. So she told me all the things that she didn't like about the job that she was in. A lot of them had to do with work-life balance. And it was very clear she was quite miserable. So I was a little confused about why she wasn't taking this job. But here's where we see like status quo bias, omission, commission bias, this idea of like the way that we process losses associated with the status quo versus some sort of new choice. And because I said to her, well, why aren't you switching? She said, well, what if I hate the new job? So I said, well, imagine it's a year from now and you stay in your current position. What are the chances in a year that you're happy? She said, well, it's 0% because I know I'm very unhappy now and that hasn't changed for quite a long time. And I said, well, what are the chances that if you take this new job in a year, you'll be happy? She said, well, I don't know. I haven't taken the job yet. I said, well, what's your best guess? And she said, well, I mean, I don't know. I guess it's like 50-50. And I said, well, is that greater than 0? You know, and she was like, oh, it all of a sudden occurred to her, like, oh, right. I'm definitely going to be unhappy in the job that I'm in. And if I go to the new job, sometimes I might be unhappy, but sometimes I will be happy. And that's better. But this idea of what if the new thing doesn't work out is such a strong force. It's that combo of like status quo bias and omission, commission, and regret aversion or loss aversion that we feel that's sort of applied asymmetrically to like the thing we're doing versus the thing we're switching to. You could see that this was getting her to stay, you know, leaning her towards staying in a job that she was already miserable in. So that's another like big force that happens. There's also something called endowment, which is the things we own, we really value really highly and we don't like to give them up. So that's another really big problem. And that's true for our ideas as well. So we have to remember that we own the things that we think. And we see people like confronted with facts that disprove the beliefs that they have and their unwillingness to give up their beliefs. This is part of that, is this, you're endowed to your own beliefs. And then this kind of all rolls into this bigger problem of identity. You know, what we do and what we believe is who we are. And so when we have to quit something, whether it's a belief or a job or actually even a cult, we have to abandon some piece of who we are. In fact, in some cases, it's almost completely who we are. And we're really unwilling to do that. So when those beliefs that you hold sort of run headlong into the facts in the world, and they come into conflict, we experience something called cognitive dissonance. It's this very uncomfortable feeling, right? Of like, the world is not agreeing with my beliefs. And there's two ways that we can relieve that dissonance. One is to change the belief. That will cause things to agree again. And one is to reject the facts. And I think it should be very intuitive to people, particularly looking at political discourse today, that rejecting the facts is like, that's the main choice. And so we just refuse to quit these things. And so when we look at kind of all of, you know, there's so many biases, and I haven't even covered all of them. There's so many biases that you can see that have to do with the way we think, the way that we're wired to think, that then you can run this thread of like kind of late quit, like we don't like to quit things. And you can see how those are all kind of coming into this thing that makes us stick to things too long.
I'm so incredibly fascinated by all of this so far. And Annie, it's sort of leading to this question, because you said moments ago, we own the things we think. Now, I'd have to assume that temperament and just our worldview and who we are as people factors into how we see or believe our ability to have the strength to make solid decisions in life. But what I'd love to know is there a factor in temperament or a person's wiring that designates the fact that they quit well? In other words, people who quit well know what or do what. Is there a factor within temperament that we should be aware of? In other words, good quitters are like this.
Well, okay, so first of all, let me just say, I think that when you look at any decision skill, there's a distribution in terms of temperament. So, you know, there are some people who are more score higher on active open-mindedness, for example. And active open-mindedness is going to help you quit better when you're open-minded to other people's points of view. And I think that's true, that there's going to be a distribution. I'm sure that elite poker players both get trained to be good quitters, but also probably come into it with a temperament that would make it so that training is going to be helpful and sticky. That being said, everyone's bad at it. I just want to make that clear. Like, everyone's pretty bad at it. And interestingly enough, I think the main factor in getting better at it is to recognize that when you're in the moment of having to face down a choice about quitting or not quitting, that you're not going to do a good job of it. And so you have to be thinking about, how do I get outside of that moment? Okay, so let me just explain what I mean by being in that moment. So let's say that you've decided that you want to eat healthy, but now you go to a kid's birthday party and there's pizza and cupcakes right in front of you. That's being in it, right? And we all know we tend to be pretty bad decision makers in that point. And, like, we've made some sort of decision about how we would like to eat. And when the pizza and cupcake is right in front of you, that's when it's just really hard to resist it. Okay, so what's true there is true of any type of decision making, right? When we're in that moment where we're deciding to quit, that's the moment where we have to sort of say, I failed, right? Like, and nobody wants to be in that moment. That's the moment where you feel like, okay, I went from, like, maybe things weren't going well, but I can turn it around, to, nope, I'm now admitting that I'm just going to lose, right? I'm never going to get that back. I'm a failure. And so that's like having a cupcake in front of you, like a bad cupcake. It's like having some electric shocks in front of you, right? Which you don't want to have to do. So I just want to make that super duper clear, that no matter what your temperament is, it's really hard when the cupcake is right in front of you. Okay, so, but what can you do? Well, there's kind of two things that you can do here. One is advanced planning. So what you can do is, when you're starting something, you can actually say to yourself, what are the signals that I might see in the future that would tell me that I ought to walk away? So let's think of some simple examples of this type of pre-commitment and sort of advanced planning. And these signals, when you write these signals now, I call them kill criteria. Okay. So it's like, if you see this stuff, stop. So here's a very simple example of a kill criterion. When you're climbing Everest on summit day, they have what's called a turnaround time. And a turnaround time means that no matter where you are on the mountain, whether you've made the summit or not, when you get to that time of day, you must turn around. And it's a matter of safety. It's so that you're not descending in darkness, which would vastly increases the chances that you're going to perish or have something really bad for you happen to you. So on summit day, that turnaround time is 1 p.m. So no matter where you are, if it's 1 p.m., you turn around. And in fact, you can use that if you're somewhere on the mountain where you realize you're not going to make it to the summit by 1 p.m. because it's already too late. So if you're 300 yards from the summit and it's already 12:30 p.m., you're not going to make it by 1 p.m. You should just turn around right then. Okay, so that's a good example where those turnaround times, that you're not leaving it to the decision maker in the moment to decide whether it's wise to continue. Instead, you're saying in advance, 1 p.m., everybody turn around. Okay, so that's a good example of a kill criteria. In stock trading, you have things like stop losses. That would be an example of a kill criteria. Now, I want to be really clear that having kill criteria set out does not mean you're going to be perfect at following them. There's, for example, in 1996 on Everest, which is chronicled in Into Thin Air, John Krakauer's amazing book, there were lots of people who didn't follow the turnaround time. The expedition leader himself, Rob Hall, got to the summit at 2 p.m. Doug Hansen got there at 4 p.m. And we know that they perished, right? So there's lots of people who don't follow the turnaround time. But the fact is that you're more likely to if you have it set out, and more people will do it, which is better than zero. And for example, Dr. Stuart Hutchinson, John Taskey, and Lou Kosiski turned around. And they were in Rob Hall's expedition, and they lived. So in stock trading, people cancel stop loss orders all the time, and they blow through them. But it's more likely that you're not going to do that if you actually set it in place. So this is why these kinds of things are so important, is because they improve your ability to think about when you should quit. But notice you're doing this in advance. And then the second thing you can do that gets you out of yourself is to have a quitting coach, is to have someone who's going to help you with those decisions to quit, and rely on the judgment of other people. Because I'm sure you see people all the time where it's very clear that they should quit, or they should shut the project down, or they're in a bad relationship or a bad job or whatever. We can see this with sports figures, right? Like, people are always like, oh, that person should be quitting. They're past their prime. And sometimes an outside observer is just better at seeing these things than you are, because you're the one facing the cupcake down, not them. And that can be really helpful. So a lot of it actually, how do you become a better quitter? I think it's just through humility, right? Like, I know I'm going to be bad at this skill, and I'm going to be particularly bad when I'm trying to make the decision right then. So I need to help myself do this, and I can do this by thinking about it in advance, or I can do this by getting someone on the outside to help me with the problem and make me better at this.
I'd love for you to connect humility to even the example you shared about, you go to the party, there's a cupcake, there's pizza there. It makes me also think of the work by Roy Baumeister with ego depletion and willpower and all that kind of stuff. Is there a connection between humility and recognizing, I don't have what it takes to make the right decision here? Safety is in a multitude of counselors. I need your help. Is there a strength to be had in vulnerability that says, I don't have what it takes to see what I need to see, to make the decision I need to make. Therefore, I'm not going to depend on willpower to muscle through this decision, whatever that might be. Any thoughts?
Well, yeah. So first of all, let me just say about the ego depletion stuff that I have to say, this is a cognitive science, that work has not replicated. So
exactly. So
I just want to be really clear about that before people think like, if I exercise, it's going to be harder for me to resist something later on in the day. That it turns out that doesn't replicate. So,
can I ask you to do something
sure.
real fast? Because I'm just deeply curious, because I've done a lot of research in willpower, and I'm like, I just don't put a lot of stock in it. What's your take? Like, blow that house of cards down if you want, Annie. Will you just kind of take of an
so basically the original finding kind of went with things like this, like if that you have this thing called ego depletion, right? Which is like when you have to sort of resist a bunch of stuff, that it makes it harder to resist other things later. And so it was like, in the morning it will be really easy for you to resist cupcakes, but at night it will be really hard because you did a bunch of other stuff. If you exercise, that will make it harder for you to resist other things because exercise is hard. There was actually work done where they were like, okay, you have to do these hard, math problems. And if I give you lemonade, then you'll do more of them because you somehow got more energy.
Because the glucose.
Or something like that. Yeah.
Yes. Uh-huh.
So it just turns out that doesn't replicate. So in science, people get findings, and then people come in and they try to replicate them. And we understand a lot more in science now about how you power up a study, which is very simply this: for the effect size that you're expecting to see, like how much of a difference is there between if you exercised in the morning or you didn't, for how much you'll be able to resist. How many people do you need? Right. So, do you need to do this across 2,000 people, or do you need to do this across 20? And also you want to make sure that you have a spread of lots of different types of people in order to be able to generalize across this. So the original work, as I recall, was if you had people do math problems and then had a plate of cookies sitting in front of them, that doing the math problems made you eat more cookies. And it doesn't replicate. So So I just kind of want to throw that out there because I think that there's lots of science that got popularized, and that
Yes.
people still believe, and it's since not been replicated, and people should
That's
know
right.
that, but also understand that if you've put a lot of stock and you've told a lot of people about ego depletion and this willpower is a limited resource, that your identity is now tied into that, that you're right, that it's that you own that belief, and that even if I tell you it doesn't replicate, and I've had people say this to me before, they're like, oh no, but I just know it's true. Right. And I'm like, but you only believed that in the first place because there was science that told you that. So when new
Uh-huh.
science comes along that says, no, that doesn't actually seem to hold up, you ought to be able to abandon your beliefs. But it's like all quitting. Right. But I still know
That's it.
it's true. And one of the ones that actually I see that the most with is Myers-Briggs. So,
Okay. Tell me
well,
more.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we know that Myers-Briggs is very popular. People will tell you their Myers-Briggs type.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of leadership will try to form teams around Myers-Briggs, and it turns out that it's just doesn't it's not predictive of anything. It's not if you take it on different if you yourself take it on different days, you'll actually you'll very often have a different type. So it's not replicable within like an individual,
Wow.
but more importantly, it doesn't predict anything. So it's kind of like the way that people in cognitive science and organizational science think about Myers-Briggs is astrology for business executives.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a very famous study done on astrological horoscopes where they gave people in the room like, oh, what's your sign? Right. And everybody told them their sign. And then they gave them a description of somebody who had their sign. So like if you're a Virgo, they would give you a description of Virgo. And then you were supposed to rate how much does this describe me? Now the key was everybody got the same description. And of course, everybody's like, it describes me to a T.
Oh my
Right? So it turns out
gosh.
Myers-Briggs is kind of like that. It's kind of like astrology. We know that your sign doesn't actually predict anything about you. It
Oh
doesn't
my
predict
gosh.
behavior or success in life or anything like that. It doesn't really make any sense that where the earth is in relation to the sun has anything to do with who you or what your personality is. But Myers-Briggs is very much like that. But I was talking to somebody who is a business consultant, and they were brought in to consult for somebody who's very, very smart. I mean, this is another thing is that, one of the things that does not necessarily predict, like, how are you going to do at these things is how intelligent you are. But anyway, they were brought in, and the person was talking about how they use Myers-Briggs to, form teams and so on and so forth. And the consultant who was up on the science said, oh, that's junk science. It doesn't actually predict anything. It's not consistent. You can't replicate it, like all these things. And the person said, no, in my
Oh my
experience, I just
gosh.
know it's true. So they were unwilling to quit Myers-Briggs. Because again, it's like so much of like, this has been my identity. I've been doing this. This is what I believe. And you can tell me your science, but I just know in my heart that it's true. Because again, when your beliefs come into headlong into conflict with the facts in the
Man.
world, you find a way to reject the facts. So just for all of the people who really believe in ego depletion out there, I know a lot of you are probably still going to believe it, but I'm telling you, it doesn't replicate.
Annie, see, you are going down a rabbit hole that I love to speak about because so many of us, and I think what you've touched on speaks to confirmation bias. We innately look for things that confirm what we already believe about life, but we live in a world where truth is relative and where we reject facts because it just doesn't fit our narrative. What else do we need to know about that, Annie?
Well,
'Cause
okay,
that's
so
really, really powerful.
I agree. So let me tell you a little story.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that this relates to what you're talking about. I think we're all so frustrated in this world that people can hold some very extreme beliefs that are just like patently and clearly false. Like the facts on the ground just do not support the beliefs, and still they cling to the beliefs. And I think that, when you're on the outside looking in on that, you're like, oh my God, what is going on? So this is a story about a cult called the Seekers that was around in the 1950s. And this cult believed that aliens from the planet Clarion were going to come and essentially wipe out humankind with a flood. So they flood the earth and wipe out humankind in December of, I think, 1954 or 1955. So there was a piece in a local paper about this woman who was sort of the original person who formed the Seekers. She believed in this and had gotten messages from the planet Clarion. And a psychologist named Leon Festinger noticed this piece. And in that piece, it said, the date of the doom, right? Which I think was like December 20th, I think. And so he said, oh, this will be very interesting. I'm going to go join the cult because I want to know what happens when on doomsday, and that's the interesting things about a doomsday cult, right? Is that they say a day that the doom is going to occur. You want to know what would happen when the aliens did not come, the earth was not flooded. Would the believers in this cult walk away from it? Okay, so there's a lot of cultish stuff going on in politics right now, right? Okay, so this is the question. When the facts just completely demonstrably, in the biggest way, conflict with what you've been living, right? What is going to happen? So he and some other collaborators infiltrate the cult. They become cult members. And now it's the night of the doom. And they're all kind of sitting around, and the clock strikes midnight, and nothing happens. So they notice, wait a minute, oh, this other clock is 5 minutes slower. This clock must be fast. That was the first thing that happened. So they wait for the other clock. So the other clock 5 minutes later strikes midnight. Nothing happens. So they all kind of hang around for a few hours. Did we get it wrong? What's the deal? And I think 2 of the cult members at that point just sort of left and went home. But the rest of them, I think it was 8 of them, stayed. And not only did they not abandon the Seekers, but they actually escalated their commitment to the idea. So first of all, they had some rationalizations, which were well, we believe so strongly that made it so that the aliens weren't going to come. And then they sort of came up with new dates that it was, so now it's 8 months later they were going to come, right? And actually a couple of the members of the cult, Cleo Armstrong and her father, waited on a hotel ramp for the aliens to come again, like 8 months later. And what's really interesting in particular about Cleo Armstrong is that she actually was a total doubter beforehand. She joined the cult. She was part of the cult. Her dad was in the cult. And, you sort of, obviously when you join a cult like that, other people think you're nuts. You usually give away all your worldly goods. So you can imagine these public displays, these actions that really say I'm defining myself by membership in this cult. So it's very much part of your identity. But she was a little there was some seances that had happened that seemed really weird. And then she noticed that other cult members were believing prank calls from students at the university in town about Clarion. And they just thought they were being duped and gullible. So she was not a super strong believer. But then after the aliens didn't come, she became a strong believer. And I think that part of the reason why that might happen is because, and she was one of the people who ended up on the ramp 8 months later waiting for the aliens again, is because you can't possibly justify, why did I throw my life away in this way? Why did I make all these extreme decisions? Why did I cut myself off from my family, right? If what I believed wasn't true. And that, I think, speaks to this problem of quitting, right? Because changing your mind is quitting. I don't believe that thing anymore.
Annie, this is coming to the head of saying for many of us, I think it's important to realize that our experiences, our thoughts, our memories don't necessarily validate truth.
No.
They validate our perceptions of truth. And those could be wrong. And right?
Yeah, and I would also add to that I think that intuitively people think that your beliefs inform your actions. So we think about something, we believe it, we decide it's true, and then that tells us sort of what we do. But I think that people need to realize that your actions very often inform your beliefs. And you can see this with Cleo Armstrong, right? She didn't really believe it beforehand, but then she did stick around and she waited for the aliens to come. And so then afterwards, when the aliens don't come, it's hard to resolve that difference, the dissonance. And so then she says, well, it becomes sort of, that becomes my beliefs, because why would I have done this otherwise? Right. And there's been some interesting studies that have been done. These are older studies in cognitive science that I think are, are pretty interesting, but they're replicable, which is, if I just come up to you and I say, hey, can you do me a favor and put this political sign in your yard? And you do it, like, you didn't go get the sign. You didn't decide you wanted something in your yard, at least not, without being prompted. And I just asked you to do me a favor and put the sign in your yard, and you do. When I measure your, how much you support that candidate, before and after you put the sign that I asked you to put in your yard, your support for the candidate goes way up after you've put the sign in your yard. And there's no other fact that has changed. Nothing about the candidate has changed. It's just that you did an action. The sign's in your yard. And that then informs your beliefs, right? Because you're trying to say, well, why would I have put the sign in my yard if I didn't really like this candidate, right? That doesn't really make any sense. And so that will strengthen your beliefs. And so I think that we need to realize that it goes both ways, and that our actions can very often inform our beliefs, and it's not just the other way around.
This has been so riveting, Annie. And just to swing things back to quitting and mindset about quitting and such, I want to go back to what you talked about earlier and even use the example of when the facts are in front of us, how often are we saying, nope, I'm still not going to believe it. My truth is my truth, whatever. We can put up whatever phrase we want around that. The motivation for loss aversion. You talked about this earlier, but I want to kind of hit this on the head for the listeners. Talk about loss aversion and then how the emotional impact plays out for many of us in decision making.
Yeah, so there's two different ways to think about loss aversion. One is loss aversion, and the other is sure loss aversion, and they both affect quitting behavior. So loss aversion and sure loss aversion both come from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky in their work on prospect theory. So loss aversion is essentially a problem with starting. It stops you from starting things, in the sense that we sort of imagine sometime in the future where maybe we incur a loss or things don't go well. We think about the regret we're going to feel and sort of the pain of that loss. And so it makes us not do something because we're afraid we might lose it. Okay. So when I was talking about why would we have a preference to stick with the status quo, even though the status quo is sort of demonstrably bad, like in the case of Dr. Olsten Martinez, well, it's because the way we process loss aversion is different for the status quo versus something that we might switch to. So notice the status quo, we're already on the path, but if we switch, we have to start something new. Right. So in considering starting something new, do I want to take the new job? Loss aversion gets recruited in a different way, because we're like, we don't want to start something that maybe we might lose at. And that's true even if the thing that we might start we'd be better off doing. So a lot of the conversation that I had with Dr. Olsten Martinez was getting her to sort of overcoming the loss aversion and saying it's okay to start this new job because the chances that you're happy are greater than on the status quo. And so, but the loss aversion was kind of stopping her from wanting to start that new path. Okay, so that's loss aversion. So that's where loss aversion really comes in is it stops us from switching from one thing to another, right? Like, we don't like to switch from a thing we're doing to another thing. It also can stop us from starting when we're just sort of starting two things and one thing has a bigger chance of losing than the other, even if the other thing would be the better choice. Okay, so that's loss aversion. So you can see how that relates to quitting. But here's the other thing that relates to quitting, something called sure loss aversion. So I think that I can most simply explain this to you if we talk about holding a stock. So if you have a stock and you bought it at 50 and it's now trading at 40, you have a loss on paper. But you have not for sure lost that money as long as you hold the stock. because the stock could go up. Luck could get you there.
Yes.
Okay. If you actually sell it at 40, you now take that loss on paper and you turn it into a realized loss or a sure loss. We don't like to do that. We would rather keep the gamble on and hope that luck goes our way and things turn around and we can wipe that loss off the books, as opposed to take the sure loss that comes with selling something. All right. So selling is quitting. And so sure loss aversion stops us from stopping something that we've started. So Richard Thaler, also a Nobel laureate, talks about the way that our mental accounting works is that when we start something like buying a stock, we open up a mental account. And when that account is in the losses, meaning that we've got some sort of loss on the books, we don't like to close the account. In other words, we don't like to stop what we're doing, which would close the account if it's in the losses. So that's where sure loss aversion comes in. Now, how does that relate to something besides a stock? Well, this goes back to that sunk cost problem, right? If you start a project, you've put time and effort and money into it. And if you stop short of the goal, then you're stopping in the losses. You're turning that loss of what you feel like, because we don't count progress along the way, sadly, because you're short of the finish line. You're saying all that time and effort and money was for naught. I didn't end up actually achieving anything. And if I stop, that means that I'm going to lose that stuff, right? If you hear this from people, like they're in a relationship, it's like, but I put so much time and effort into it. I don't want to stop now. And this is so strong, this sure loss aversion, that you can find multiple stories. There's one in particular, which I have in the book with Siobhan O'Keefe, of people running marathons, breaking bones in the middle of them, and continuing on. Now, why would you do that? Like you break your leg on mile 8, as she did, of the London Marathon, and she keeps going. Because if you're short of the finish line, you're in the losses. It doesn't matter that you ran 8 miles, which were more than you did when you started. You're 18 miles short of the finish line. And if you stop then, it's a sure loss. I didn't finish. So this is the thing that we have to understand, is that both loss aversion and sure loss aversion create these problems, right? Which is, loss aversion stops you from starting, but it also stops you from switching.
Yes.
And sure loss aversion stops you from closing accounts. It stops you from stopping things.
You have this statement in the book, and I think it summarizes what you just shared with us. And tell me if I'm right on. If I'm off, then you can correct me. You said this, quote, "We are more tolerant of bad outcomes that come from sticking with what we are already doing than the bad outcomes that come from switching to something new."
Yep.
That's a gut punch, Annie.
Yeah, so that's the asymmetry with loss aversion, right? That's the Sarah Olson Martinez problem. But you see that, it's like you see that all the time, right? It's like someone will be in a miserable relationship and you'll say, why aren't you breaking up with them? What if I never find anybody? What if the next relationship I'm in is bad? It's like, but the one you're in is terrible.
Yeah. Annie.
So why are we tolerating that, right? Well, because it's more certain, right? We don't like sort of wandering into the wilderness, the ambiguity of, will it be good or will it be bad? Somehow that's so much worse for us than staying in something that we already know is bad. And this is part of the reason why I feel like, people think about grit as synonymous with courage. And I think that quitting takes a tremendous amount of courage, because you have to be willing to take those losses. You have to be saying, it's okay that I failed. Because by quitting this thing that's failing, I'm freeing myself up to be able to go do things that are better. But I know that other people might think I'm a loser for it. If I quit the marathon at 8 miles, they're going to be like, what a loser, you didn't finish the marathon. That takes an act of courage to be able to walk away in that situation. To be able to quit the job or the relationship that's awful, even though you don't know what's on the other side of that decision. Because maybe you won't find somebody else. Maybe your next relationship will be bad, right? But it takes a tremendous amount of courage, I think, to be willing to quit. And we should think of quitting as a courageous act, not as a cowardly one.
We should think of quitting as a courageous act, not a cowardly one. Annie, I think that's a perfect place to land the plane on this conversation today. In fact, folks, the book Quit, she is Annie Duke. Go to the show notes right now at wintoday.tv. Get a copy of this book. I'm serious. It's just powerful. Annie, here's where I'd love to land with you. So maybe some take-home tips for people. They're in a place of vacillating between, do I quit this job? Do I stay? I've got my resume out. I'm prospecting. Or I'm in a relationship. I've been here, as we've talked about already, for 5-6 years. I'm really comfortable with it. I know it's not great. If you could give people some bullet points to take away from this conversation, some actionable items, what might a couple be?
Yeah, so I think the first one is, if you're considering it, it's okay if you don't make the decision today. In fact, it's probably better. And instead, what you should say to yourself is, how long is it okay for me, for the status quo, to maintain? Right? So if you're in a bad job or you're in a bad relationship, say, if I'm thinking right now, how long am I willing to stay in this without seeing things improve? Okay, so that's number one. So that might be 2 weeks. It might be 2 months. I coach this with executives all the time who are thinking about whether they should lay somebody off. I say, but they're really struggling with it. And I say, how long is it okay for them to be performing at this level in the job? Right? So just sort of figure that out for yourself. Like, how long am I okay with this relationship being the way it is, without showing any signs of improvement, and figure out what that time period is. So let's say it's 2 months, right? Now say to yourself, okay, if things are really going better, what am I going to see?
Mm-hmm.
Let me know what that is. And if things are going poorly, what will I see? And write those things down for yourself. And then say, okay, I'm going to revisit this and I'm going to see what's going on. And if things, if I see these signals that I've written down that things are bad, then I'm going to either walk away or do something else. So it might be like forced marriage counseling, right? Like that could be something that could happen, right? Or confront your leadership, or you might just quit, right? And if things actually are hitting the mark, for this means that things are turning around, okay, then that's great. And then repeat the process and say, what do I need to see in the next 2 months? And go that way. So it just helps you, because you're kind of helping your future self, right? So, this is something when I'm coaching leadership about letting people go, they actually sit down with the employee and they say, okay, things aren't going well right now. I really believe in you. I think that you can turn this around. Let's talk about what's reasonable for me to see from you in 6 weeks, right? That's going to show us that you've turned it around. And if you fall short of that, then we have to have a conversation, right? And it's just an easier way for everybody to process that situation. It creates much more rational and less impulsive behavior, I think, and it gets you to decisions that are better. So I think that that's sort of big tip number one. And then big tip number two is share it with somebody else. Could be a therapist, for example, in the case of a relationship, where you really work that kind of thing with a therapist and say, what are the things that I'm going to be seeing in the future? So, it's kind of going back to that simple thing. Like, if I'm going to go up Everest, let me think about what time I need to turn around on the mountain. What are the other signs and signals that might tell me that things aren't going well? You're thinking about something that's going to be occurring in the future. Like, how bad does the weather need to be? How heavy does the fog need to be? How slow does the line of people in front of me need to be? What conditions, what are the snow conditions that I need to see, or that I would be unhappy seeing? And think about what those are, and that's going to get you to that situation a lot better. And then I think just kind of overall, separate from like get outside help, write down what's going to happen in the future. I think the most important thing for people to process is that everything that you're doing right now, this moment, is preventing you from doing other things. And I think this is incredibly important because we lose sight of that, right? So the job that you're doing is preventing you from other jobs. Now, that if the job you're doing is great, that's not a problem. But if it's bad, that's not so good. That if I'm deciding I love to play tennis, the time that I take for tennis is time that I can't spend on other things, maybe other sports, for example, so on and so forth. So I think that this is the thing that we have to remember, is that for every single thing that you're doing, that is time and attention and money that you cannot spend on anything else, because you're only one person with limited time. So here's the deal. Life's too short to spend your time on stuff that isn't worthwhile, just because you think that gritting it out is somehow a good thing, because it's stopping you from getting to things that might actually get you to your goals faster, that might allow you to fulfill the things in your life better. So get that through your head. And then in concert with that, realize if that's the case, then when you are pursuing certain things, when you are already on a path, when you have already started something, that it's okay to explore other stuff. We have this lore around plan Bs that they're bad. We hear this all the time. Like, if you want to play professional basketball, don't have a plan B. Right? If you want to be a famous musician, don't have a plan B. And I think that that's very toxic advice, because you can be fully committed to your plan A and still have backup plans. And it's really important to explore and develop those backup plans, because when plan A starts going south, it's a lot easier to switch to something that you already have in your back pocket than wander into the wilderness of I don't know. Right? It was easier for Sarah Olson Martinez, for sure, to quit her job because she already had an offer, because she was exploring other options. It makes it easier than quitting and not knowing what's coming next. And sometimes, here's the really big thing, is that when you're exploring those plan Bs, it turns out that plan B is better than your plan A. And you get to find that out. And that's also really good. So I just think like, let's just take away the sort of negative aspect that we think about when it comes to quitting, and realize that, like, your job in life is to do the things that are going to get you to where you want to go the fastest. And the path that you're on is not necessarily going to be the fastest path. How could it be? When you chose to take that path, there was a whole bunch of stuff you didn't know. And then you find out a bunch of stuff afterwards. And when you find that stuff out, pay attention to it, because sometimes it's telling you to get off the path. And that's okay.
Annie, this has been one of my favorite conversations I've had in a really long time. I'm so thankful for you. This has been remarkable. Anything else you want to leave with the listeners today? You have given us, if you're watching this on YouTube right now, guys, look, like, Annie, these are my notes.
Oh my gosh.
I've just gone crazy, and I'm just thankful. Anything else you want to leave with us today that we need to know? Obviously, we all need to get a copy of this book.
Well, thank you. Well, I would like to leave one thing. So I just wish that these types of decision skills, whether it's stuff that I wrote about in Thinking in Bats or How to Decide or This Book Quit, we're adults listening to this stuff, and we're learning this stuff as adults. Like, I think it would be much better if we actually took the time to teach our children these types of decision skills. Like, we know so much about what great decision making looks like, and there's so much education given to adults around this topic, but not really to kids. There's kind of like vague directives for critical thinking, but mostly we're teaching kids trigonometry, which I don't think is particularly useful unless you're building a barn or sailing without computers.
Right.
Which I assume you can learn as an adult. And so I did co-found an organization called the Alliance for Decision Education, and we're trying to bring decision education, decision skills training to K through 12 and get that into every classroom. And so if people did enjoy this conversation and the types of topics that we're talking about, and you believe that this would be something good for kids to learn, I would love it if people went and, just checked it out and visited the website. I'm incredibly passionate about the cause, and I'd love people to become passionate with me.
That's so good. What is the website? I'll put this in the show notes.
If people Google the Alliance for Decision Education, it will come up.
Perfect. Yeah. We will do that. Annie, I'm so thankful for you.
Oh, thank you.